And then as they progress and they continue to game late into the night, and then these binges go on the weekend, and they're at the same time listening to music, and they're Facebooking and Twittering and Instagramming and all of this, the problem continues to grow worse. Their cognitive abilities, or their ability to retain information, to concentrate and to focus, it deteriorates, and they start to act like someone who's had a severe head injury, and yet they've never bumped their head. And it can turn into full-blown psychiatric illness. One of the reasons, too, that people keep their heads down is an anxiety disorder known as FOMO. This particularly is germane to those who are addicted to social media or use it an awful lot. 56%, in fact, of the general population who engage with social media have this particular phobia. And what FOMO stands for is a fear of missing out. And with young people, it's most often conversations that are going on in the background. It's just good old peer pressure, but it's on steroids. They can't stand not knowing what people are saying because they might be talking about them, or they might be ganging up and cyberbullying someone. And these activities turn out, they're very addictive, and they keep people's heads down. Chemical changes take place. There's a little loop that forms in the reward center of the brain, and the pleasure center of the brain is known as the nucleus accumbens, and it receives these little drips of dopamine, and it's very addictive, and it gets kind of in a loop, and it'll even make you want to check your email when you don't want to check your email. It becomes habit forming. But in the case of FOMO, it applies to social media. Another one that is more predominant is phone separation anxiety. It is a real disorder. I've taken phones off of kids before in media camps that I've been teaching, and you can watch. I quite enjoy it, actually. But there's a term for it. It's called nomophobia. It is a fear of missing your phone. And it also includes when you get out of cell coverage or if your battery starts to go flat. Now, 66% of the general population has this disorder, and not surprisingly, the younger you are, the more underdeveloped the brain, the more tender it is, the more prone you would be to these types of chemical and neural circuitry changes or rewiring in the brain. How does this manifest itself? What kind of cultural changes has it made? Well, we see people's heads down all the time in restaurants, which used to be associated with as a social event. It's now predominantly a screen event, well, for a lot of people. The first thing that I want to cover with you, particularly those of you who have kids in school, those of you who work in offices and you have multiple screens. Now, you saw my desk, so I'm not fussing at you. What I'm suggesting to you is that you may need to change the order and the method by which you work with these screens. Probably most of you. I had to. Multitasking has received quite a bit of attention. Multitasking is actually a misnomer. Multitasking used to be in job descriptions, and people would go to apply for a job, and if they were considered to actually be hired, they'd be handed the job description, and somewhere in there that would often say, in order to do this job successfully, you must be a good multitasker. How many of you remember those days when they used to have that? As it turns out, that grand experiment was a failure. A lot of people just haven't received the memo that it's been a failure. And then big universities, some have studied this, and a lot now is finally coming out, and it turns out the brain cannot multitask. Now, for those of you who are nerdy and you have multi-core processors and you know what threading is with software, your brain cannot actually do multiple tasks at the same time. A computer can do it, but the brain cannot. The brain actually switches tasks, or it's called task switching. It's called a number of things, but it actually switches tasks very rapidly, but it's still working linearly, and there's a problem with that. That activity, and I'm not even talking about doing immoral or sinful things, just by the act of you multitasking, or what you think is multitasking, or switch tasking very rapidly, it is also causing chemical changes in the brain, and the neural circuitry is being altered, and there are side effects to this. This is how a kid will typically sit down to do their homework these days. They'll sit down with a tablet or a computer, and they have their assignment in front of them, and let's say they sit down to do math. Now, the reality is, they have been hardwired, most kids these days, for instant gratification because of heavy computer use. And basically what that means is they get bored very, very quickly. The attention span has decreased. It's been induced. And so they find math very boring compared to the internet, and so they start to switch tasks rapidly. They're looking for relief from the boredom of math, and so while they are sitting there with their math assignment and their math book, or if they're doing it on a computer, they also have their phone with headphones on, and they're fielding text messages. They also have Facebook open, Instagram, and they're constantly switching back and forth. So maybe they'll jump over to Facebook, and then in a few minutes later, they'll switch back to math and work on math just a little bit more. But the boredom sets in, and so they'll look for relief, and they'll say, oh, I'll just go to another level of Angry Birds. And then maybe you scream out across the house, and you'll go, are you doing your homework? The kid goes, yeah, sure. Evil little creatures. And then they finally finish their math and they jump over to the next subject in this vicious cycle called task switching, and it's also known as toggling. They do this. Now look, I'm not saying they've done anything horrible. I'm just saying it's wreaking havoc with the circuits in the brain and the chemistry as well. So we need to be very careful about multitasking. And in the office environment, you need to be very careful as well, because in neurological circles now that they've actually studied it, it turns out that you end up making a lot of mistakes. And grades around the world are not improving because of technology. I would say, for the educators who are here, we need to rethink the implementation of one-to-one. I'm not down on the technology, but it's not being used properly, obviously. It does not improve your learning. The cognitive abilities actually decrease. So your retention, concentration, all of that goes down. And then, this is another disturbing thing. It is clearly linked to clinical depression. The chemical changes that take place in the brain lend themselves to anxiety and depression. And of course, it takes you forever to do your homework. So some changes need to be made. I didn't say throw the internet away. It's a great place to gather research, but I'll give you some tips and hints, both from the classroom perspective and then at home when the kids are doing the homework, in just a few minutes. But there are a lot of studies, for those of you that like to study this sort of thing, that talk about multiple media use is clearly tied to anxiety and depression. Now let's talk about schemas and what happens on the inside of the brain when we multitask. This is one of the reasons why we need to really start to work linearly or sequentially, the way the brain was made to work. The brain wants to do one thing at a time, and it doesn't want to switch rapidly. It wants to stay on one thing for extended periods of time, but we don't like it because it doesn't feel good. There are ways to feel better and get these little dopamine squirts with our mobile devices. But we have to talk about schemas. So let's talk about schemas. These are just basically associations and the circuitry that connects the bits of information as it comes into the brain. So these are networks of associations in the brain. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to have a look at this next picture, and I'll illustrate. Just have a look. Now, instantly, how many of you have thought of a movie that he's in? How many of you have thought of the two prominent girlfriends and wife that he's had? Okay. Now, what's happened, without me even, before I even said that, you raised your hand because you already thought of it. What has happened, you looked at his picture, and you automatically associated with other parts of his career. Does that make sense? So that's what a schema is. And the problem with multitasking is that those schemas do not happen properly when you multitask. Therefore, you can't retrieve information properly, and it doesn't store very well. In fact, it stores in a scattered fashion, basically scatterbrained. Grades go down. Nicholas Carr, in his wonderful book called The Shallows, what the internet is doing to our brains. It's a little lengthy, but bear with me. Imagine filling a bathtub with a thimble. That's the challenge involved in transferring information from working memory into long-term memory. By regulating the velocity and intensity of information flow, media exert a strong influence on this process. When we read a book, the information faucet provides a steady drip which we can control the pace of our reading. Through our single-minded concentration on the text, we can transfer all or most of the information, thimbleful by thimbleful, into long-term memory and forge the rich associations essential to the creation of schemas. With the net, we face many information faucets all going full blast. Our little thimble overflows as we rush from one faucet to the next. We're able to transfer only a small portion of the information to long-term memory, and what we do transfer is a jumble of drops from different faucets, not a continuous, coherent stream from one source. The information flowing into our working memory at any given moment is called our cognitive load. When the load exceeds our mind's ability to store and process the information, when the water overflows the thimble, we're unable to retain the information or to draw connections with the information already stored in our long-term memory. We can't translate the new information into schemas. Our ability to learn suffers, and our understanding remains shallow.